and welcome to Buffy and the Art of Story, a podcast that usually recaps one episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer at a time, focusing on its story elements. Today, though, in honor of Halloween, I'm talking with Tyffany D. Neiheiser, author of supernatural thriller Not Dead Enough, about how grief plays into the stories in the Buffyverse. I am Lisa M. Lilly, author of the Awakening Supernatural Thriller series and the Q.C. Davis crime novels, as well as the Writing as a Second Career books for writers. If you'd like to get more Buffy and the Art of Story content and writing tips, join the Patreon community at patreon.com/Lisa M. Lilly. That's Lisa, M as in Marie, Lilly. Today, Tyffany and I are talking about how Season 1 sets up grief in the Buffyverse, Buffy's grief over killing Angel, Willow's grief over the loss of Tara, and what role grief played in Season 7 when Buffy's friends kick her out in empty places. There are some spoilers for the whole of Season 7 in this episode, so if you've been following along in the podcast and you have not watched the second half of Season 7 yet, you may want to hold off on listening to this episode. Before we get to the interview, a little more about our guest. Tyffany D. Neiheiser writes young adult thrillers and horror novels, blending real-world mental health issues with supernatural. When she's not reading or writing, she's rewatching Buffy the Vampire Slayer, hiking, or skating. When it comes to mental health, she's worked with all ages in hospice, mobile crisis, a mental health clinic, and client advocacy. She's passionate about conversations about mental health and why we should be talking about it in fiction as well as in real life. You can find Tyffany D. Neiheiser in random coffee shops or more reliably at Tyffany D. Neiheiser, Neiheiser.com or on Instagram at writer_Tyffany, Tyffany. Okay, let's dive into the Hellmouth. Hi, Tyffany.
Hi.
It is great to see you. I'm really excited about our topic today, which was something you emailed me and suggested about how Buffy the Vampire Slayer as a series deals with grief. What was it about that spoke to you or sparked that idea?
So I was a mental health therapist for a while. My internship was specifically in grief. I worked in hospice. And it was not the internship I wanted, but it turned out to be the internship I needed. I was not a good person to deal with grief, so I would have been a terrible therapist dealing with people feeling their feelings like that. So I'm so grateful that I ended up with that internship. I love seeing mental health in media. So like in novels and TV, movies, all that kind of thing. And I always felt like Buffy did a masterful job of blending kind of that supernatural horror stuff that I crave with the mental health aspect of it. And they do mental health in so many ways so well that when I started thinking about what kinds of things I could look at within the Buffyverse, because I love how you use Buffy as a lesson for writing. So I do the same thing for myself, just to kind of look at what can I learn from this. And when I started looking at it, I realized that grief is a theme that kind of ties all 7 seasons together, and they do a masterful job with it. So that's what got me really interested in thinking about that and how they work with that, because it's not a topic any of us want to talk about.
In day-to-day conversation, it can be a very difficult topic, and even if someone is grieving, they often feel like they have to not speak of it or hide it. So I think that makes stories even more important. And what you said reminded me that I wanted to have you share a little bit of your biography before we started, but I just threw a question at you right away. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background?
So I started off in more like case management, just working with people and helping them access services. And at a certain point, I realized that I wanted to do more than that. I wanted to actually do therapy with people, kind of help them in a more hands-on way. So when I went back to grad school to do that, and I got my internship in hospice, and that's where I really realized that this I really felt called to this, mental health and all that. My most interesting job, the one I get asked about most, was in mobile crisis, where people call a central crisis line. And if they were suicidal or homicidal, me and my partner would get dispatched out to their house or their school or the corner of X street and Y street. And we would work with them and get them the services that they needed or take them to the hospital if that's what they needed. And in that job, I've worked with all ages. So we've seen a lot.
Such an important job. I didn't even know there was such a thing, and that is wonderful that there are those people who do that and that you were one of them.
So Arizona, this was back when I lived in Arizona. Arizona gets a bad rep for mental health services, but that was a program that was ahead of its time. And I know that they are trying to spread it to other jurisdictions because it is so incredibly helpful. But it's not a widespread thing at this point, I don't think.
So let's go to Buffy. Before we started recording, we were talking about season 1, and you mentioned how well you think that season 1 sets up the rest of the series, including how the Buffyverse treats grief. So tell me what you meant by that.
So season 1 Buffy is all about she doesn't want to be the Slayer. She wants to be a normal girl, and she keeps trying to resist that. She keeps trying to blend those lives, the normal life with being the Slayer, and she is trying to have it all, which is obviously something we want her to have, but it's not something that's always realistic because she can't tell everybody that she's the Slayer. They think she's crazy. She's on a date and vampires come. I mean, it's just not a great recipe for anything. So the whole first season, she is resisting that call and trying to figure out what her place is in the world. And in Prophecy Girl, the last episode of that season, she is told that there's a prophecy that she will die when she meets the master. It has some of the most heart-wrenching lines in it, like when she says to Giles, "I'm 16, I don't want to die." Because we can all relate to that. Like, none of us want to die, especially when we're 16. She resists that. And then Willow says to her, it wasn't our world anymore, it was the vampire's world. And Buffy realizes what being the Slayer means, and she has to make a decision. Is she going to be the one who steps up and does the job, or is she going to keep trying to walk that line that you really can't? So when she makes that decision at the end of season 1 that she is going to own being the Slayer, I think that Buffy has faced her own death at that moment. I mean, she did literally die, but she also was ready for it before she died. She walked in there fully knowing that she was going to die, and she came to a place of acceptance for that. So I think it sets up how she deals with grief for the rest of the seasons, and also how other people manage their own grief around her, because Buffy has had her existential crisis, whereas the others kind of are working through that as the seasons go on.
That's an interesting thought, that Buffy processes so much that first season. She dies, and she accepts that that is part of the deal. And before that, she knew it, but I think there's a difference between knowing something intellectually and she has that struggle with, I want a normal life, but not quite dealing with, also it's premature death, almost certainly, which she talks about much later in season 5 when she's talking to Giles about, I know an early death is part of it, but I'd like to have a long expiration date, like a bag of Cheetos. So she probably makes that shift there at the end between, if I have to die doing this job, I will, and I'm going to do all the things I can to push it back as far as I can. I was also so struck by that decision Buffy makes, because it's not based on some outer authority telling her this is what's right, this is what you have to do. It's out of her strong sense of what's right, and if this is the world, if she doesn't do this, as Willow says, it's not our world anymore, and Buffy is the only one with the power potentially to stop it. And it just seemed like such a strong, I don't know if message is the word, such a strong theme, doing what is right based on how you see the world and the world you want to live in, even if you may not be there to live in it.
And I think it's so important what she does in that last episode. When she makes the decision, she makes the decision. So Giles says to her, "You don't have to do this. I'm going to go fight the master. I've been with my books too long." And she knocks him out and says, "No, this is my job. I am going to do it."
Yeah.
And I think that that's such a powerful thing because she's made a
Yeah,
choice.
she's given an escape route after she makes the choice.
Yes.
And you're right. She's made it, and she's not going to take that out that Giles offers. What do you think about the first episode of season 2 when she was bad? Buffy comes back from the summer. She's pretty awful to her friends. Do you think that relates to, is she having to deal again with that grief, or do you think that's a different issue?
I think that is part of her grief, but I think part of the grief is realizing that if she can die, the people around her can die. Things just got serious in Prophecy Girl. She died. And up till then, she was resistant to her friends helping, but she did let them. But they're human. And at this point, Willow doesn't have any powers. Xander's human. Giles hasn't shown us who he really is yet. So we don't know that he's, a bad dude who can take care of himself. So I think that Buffy is pushing everybody away because she is worried about them. She is pre-grieving them. I don't think it's a conscious decision because it wouldn't be for most people. They wouldn't think, "Oh, well, I'm afraid that my friends will die, so I will be as rude to them as possible." It's just
Right.
what we do as humans.
I agree. I think she's not aware what's driving her behavior. That makes it all that much more kind of heartbreaking for her that we see her go through this. And so wonderful when her friends at the end understand and are there for her, and it doesn't drive them away, and it's not just because she came back and saved them.
Probably if I had to pick one, I don't know, soundbite or something that I learned from working with hospice, my mentor told me this and I've never forgotten it. We grieve the way we live. And that is such an important message because everybody grieves differently and there's no one right way. When you look at Buffy, they are so consistent with how they treat Buffy with grief because Buffy sees herself as a loner. She's the one girl in all the world who can do this. She has to take care of everything on her own. She can't depend on other people, not because they're not dependable, but because she's the one. So every time you see her grieving, what you see is her either pushing people away or physically running away.
You think about after season 2, she has to kill Angel when he's become Angel again, and then she leaves town alone.
Doesn't talk to anyone.
Lives in an assumed name. Yeah, doesn't until she meets Lily in Anne. She doesn't connect with anybody that we can see. Yeah, that's a really good point, and that is her way of dealing with it. And then she returns. And her friends, I struggle, like, as I said on the podcast at the time, with how they treat Buffy when she comes back. But maybe that goes a little bit to your point of there's more than grief going on, for one thing.
Right, yes.
Willow feels Buffy abandoned her, but there is something to that. I think that they haven't gone through the same trajectory with grief, and they're also not dealing with directly with their feelings about her being gone, and probably about what they know she must have had to do.
I think that they just don't know how to talk to her. I mean, what do you say? Sorry you had to kill the love of your life?
Yeah.
After you should have killed him before he murdered Jenny. I mean,
Yeah.
how do you,
Yeah.
There's no good way to address that. And they're teenagers and they have so many mixed feelings about things that I'm pretty sure that they just didn't know what to say. So they are trying to act normal because they don't want her to leave again. But of course that never works, suppressing your feelings. And then there's the explosion.
Yes.
I also thought it was interesting when I was thinking about Dead Man's Party was that the monster of the week in Dead Man's Party is zombies. So it's like all those undead feelings that you had buried come back and attack you no matter how much you try to suppress them, because that's how feelings work, right? Like you're like, "Oh no, I'm fine.
Right.
I'm fine. I'm good." And then boom.
And it's interesting that Giles, it makes sense that he's the one who eventually gets Buffy to talk about what happened with Angel, because for one thing, although he suffered this huge loss with Jenny Calendar, he is the most emotionally healthy and able to see what's happening. And he gets Buffy to talk in a very roundabout way. He does ask her a few times, but he's telling her, oh, it's this spell. Maybe he recognized that, yeah, when Buffy's grieving, this is how she deals with it. She does isolate. She does pull away, so he can't come at it directly with, let's talk about your grief. Let's talk about what you went through. He just keeps opening this space and giving her a different reason, a work reason to talk about it, a Slayer reason.
And I agree with you that Giles is probably the most emotionally healthy. I mean, I would hope so. He's the adult on the show, so, but I mean, that doesn't mean anything. I know lots of adults who aren't that healthy.
Yeah.
But he is a good mentor to her.
Yes, very. And I feel like Joyce, if it was not her daughter ran away, if it was someone else's daughter, if she was helping Willow, she probably would have a lot of insight and could have some of that emotional maturity, but it has to be very hard for her because she has so many emotions of her own loss of Buffy over the summer, her fears that Buffy was dead, that she was never coming home, and that mix of anger and guilt over the things that she said to Buffy.
There's also a level with Joyce, especially, is that she has to recontextualize everything that she's thought she knew about her daughter. She thought that her daughter was just having problems in her old school, and that's why she burned down the gym. And she thought that her daughter was just a problem student. And, you know, there were lots of things that she thought she was sneaking out at night.
Yeah, getting in some fights.
She learns this information, and suddenly, not only is she upset about what she's learned about Buffy, she probably feels a little dumb. I mean, even though she couldn't possibly know, she probably feels like, oh my goodness, how did I miss all the signs? That there was more going on.
Yeah, and it is like Buffy to her is a different person. I've always struggled with, was Buffy in season 6, we have that episode where she has flashbacks to a mental institution. Did that happen in the original timeline, or was that something that changed when the monks changed the world and Dawn was introduced? Is that one of the things that potentially is a different history? I think it probably was in the original timeline, and we don't ever hear about it, but that adds a layer as well of Joyce feeling, she did try to tell me way back, we institutionalized her, and then maybe went into denial or whatever it is. That adds so many layers that I'm not sure I'm not sure they knew that was going to be something that was part of Buffy's story.
Yeah, I think there's like a tiny reference in season 1 or season 2 about Buffy having been in therapy or something, but it's not anything that's clear foreshadowing. I always thought that Normal Again was just more about Buffy's fears about what could happen, because it is kind of crazy. She fights vampires and demons, and she's the one girl in all the world. Come on now. So I feel like it's easier to believe that she's just got a mental illness and should be locked up for her own safety.
Yeah, and it makes sense that Buffy comes to believe that. I feel like they wrote that really well and used what the series had so far. I completely bought that Buffy would, looking at it when she is so confused and still under the influence of this spell and this demon, would conclude that, yeah, it was a mental illness.
And I think that if you had put that to her in season 1, I think that's what she would have wanted, that there was something that she could talk over in therapy or take some medication, and then she'd go on and live the rest of her life like a regular person, and that she wouldn't have all this responsibility. So, you know, I see that as another part of the whole Buffy character, that she would kind of rather have that be the way it is. If she could have her mom back and her dad back together and just be a girl without all these responsibilities, that's very seductive.
Especially if she could do it in that scenario where she never was the Slayer. It wasn't real, because we see in Helpless when they do the test on her and she thinks briefly that she's lost her strength and she's lost, like, maybe she can't be the Slayer anymore. And it's really disturbing to her because now that is part of who she is. And it's because she knows what's out there. She knows about the vampires. She knows about everything. So then given the choice there, I think she would still choose to be the Slayer, but that's because that's a real thing.
Right.
The option to have it be like, oh, this is not real at all. This was all just a hallucination, or it was mental illness. It's something that you can just wipe away. And that would wipe away all that pain and loss of not just her mom, but her father leaving. We deal with that a little. Buffy has that grief too, that she has the fear that he'll leave that we see in nightmares, but we never deal that much directly with him just fading out of her life. Here and there, it's referenced when he doesn't show for her birthday the 1 year. And then, of course, after Joyce dies, that is more directly, but that's more loss that Buffy has that she doesn't really, we don't really see her process that.
Because she's the lone wolf and she doesn't have time. She doesn't want to deal with things. She just wants to push them away and keep moving on.
And to some extent, her job as the Slayer often requires that, because she can't be like, hey, hold on, demon that's attacking me. I have some emotional things that I need to go through. So she uses her slaying as a way to both ignore those feelings, but sometimes process them, where we see her in fights, in a way dealing with her emotions, and yet at the same time it forces her, as she says, to kind of be hard and to have that fear that if she lets herself feel too much, she'll be vulnerable and she won't be a good Slayer. Even as she talks about embracing her emotions back in season 2 to Kendra, she's really in this difficult spot of, maybe the emotions could help you sometimes, but they could also get you in trouble as a Slayer. Because we are talking with Tyffany, and because I loved her book, Not Dead Again, so much, I want to share with you the description of it. Charlotte survived the car crash that killed her boyfriend, Jerry, but that night, everything changed. Charlotte wants desperately to get back to normal, whatever that means now, and start reconnecting with friends she hasn't spoken to in months. And she's trying to work through her PTSD with the help of her therapist, only she can't tell the truth about Jerry or what really happened the night he died. Just when Charlotte thinks she might be moving on, someone starts sending her threatening messages claiming to be Jerry, saying things only he would know. But it can't really be Jerry because there's no such thing as ghosts. The cold spots in her room must be a draft, and the noises she hears must be the house creaking. There has to be a logical explanation for all of it, because if ghosts are real, then Jerry came back for her just like he always said he would. Not Dead Enough is a gripping exploration of trauma from debut author Tyffany D. Neiheiser, about a girl who realizes that running from the past will help you survive, but everything you try to escape will eventually find you in the end. Perfect for fans of Courtney Summers, Laura Nowlin, and Kathleen Glasgow, as well as crossover readers who love Amber Smith. Look for Not Dead Again at your favorite bookstores and online retailers.
There's a big point of made that Slayers don't have friends or family, and that's part of what makes Buffy different. So she's always got this fine line to walk, because her friends do get used as bait sometimes, and they do put her, not them, but just their existence does put her in situations where someone could get hurt, and she has to make decisions to save a person she loves over the world. We see that in The Gift, where she's ready to sacrifice the world for Dawn, even though it makes no sense. I mean, if everybody in the world is going to be sacrificed, then
Dawn will be gone too, yeah.
But from an emotional standpoint, of course it makes sense. You can't sacrifice your sister.
You said something earlier about the other characters' journeys with grief, and that made me think of season 4, where Willow
Hmm.
deals with so much grief over Oz. First, his cheating on her with Veruca,
Hmm.
and then him leaving. What are your thoughts on that?
Willow wants attention and validation from those people around her, which is not a bad thing. I mean, sometimes when we hear that people want attention and validation, we think that they're self-centered, and she's not. She just isn't very sure of herself. She's not very confident. So she's always looking outside of herself for, did I do a good job with this? Did I help? So when we look at Willow's grief, she lashes out when she's in grief. She doesn't always mean to. She doesn't mean to hurt people, but it's just that she doesn't want to handle things alone. She wants the opposite of that. So we see that in Something Blue, where she feels like no one is paying enough attention to her. They have their own things. And, Willow's right. They're not paying enough attention to her. But from the standpoint of a human who has to live in this world, it really does get exhausting to listen to someone who's in pain. It's hard and it hurts. None of us want to deal with pain, and we don't want to deal with someone else's pain either. So it makes sense to me why Xander and Buffy kind of get a little tired of listening to Willow. So she doesn't feel hurt, so she lashes out and makes them hear her. And we see that throughout the series. Whenever Willow is grieving, she lashes out, and you can't help but pay attention to her at that point.
Yeah, I never thought about that aspect of it, even though she does say it in Something Blue, more or less. She's like, everyone just wants me to get over this.
Hmm.
And that is also true. Our society has a lot of
Hmm.
messages about how fast you're
Absolutely.
supposed to just get back into things. But yeah, she makes herself heard. And when in season 6 she is grieving over Tara, she
Hmm.
lashes out, and everything is, how do we stop Willow? How do we save Willow? Or if you're Andrew and Jonathan, how do we protect ourselves against her?
I think the really interesting thing about the way Willow grieves is I think that her feelings very closely match the way a lot of people feel. When Willow is grieving, she feels like the world should stop for her. And as anybody who's been through
Yeah.
grief, you look around and you're like, why are people still laughing and getting coffee and doing normal things? Part of my world just ended. How are you okay? And it feels like everybody should
Yeah.
not be okay. So Willow kind of manifests that a lot more. I feel like she's so relatable with that because I feel like if the rest of us had power to do that after a grief episode, we would. We'd cast a black cloud over everything and be like, nobody can be happy. You all need to stop for a little
I
while.
so feel for Willow because there is, in Something Blue, there is that mix of, I feel like our culture should allow more time for grief and more space for it. And at the same time, when I've gone through it, sometimes doing things, even though I feel awful, does help a little. Like, you need
Hmm.
both. Both things are true. It can be
Hmm.
good to try to continue to do things and to go out and not talk about it all the time, not spend all your time focused on it. And yet it's also not healthy to never process and just keep moving. And I know in my life, I would often just be like, okay, I just have to act like things are
Hmm.
fine. And I was so very clearly not fine, but it I needed to, looking back, would say to myself, hey,
Hmm.
stop. It just give yourself 10
Right.
minutes in a day to just stop and feel those
Hmm.
feelings. And then hopefully a little more than 10 minutes at some point. At the same time, I felt all I'm feeling is this. It's all I feel, and it's never going to stop. And so seeing Willow go through that is, as you said, so relatable and so real. That's one of the things I love about
Hmm.
supernatural shows, that they allow us to have these metaphors and these stories that are about monsters, but they're also about
Right.
emotions.
Literal and figurative demons.
Yes, yes. I have not really thought about this. What is Xander's? He doesn't have the same kinds of grief, but he has
Hmm.
losses. Even though he leaves Anya at the altar, it is a loss for him as well. Do you think we see, well, his eye, of course,
Right.
that's a huge loss.
Yes. Xander gets a lot of flack. There are a lot of people out there who don't like Xander because in a lot of ways he's not great. But one thing about Xander is I think that he generally tries to make everybody happy. He generally tries to be the peacemaker, with some exceptions, like he hates Angel and definitely tries to
Right.
sabotage him. But I think that he questions himself a lot, and I think that he generally tries to look at the whole situation, and then he kind of moves on. The thing with Anya, he knew that that demon wasn't showing him a glimpse of the future, but he broke up with Anya because he felt like he couldn't be a good husband. He looked at the situation and he thought, this is right, but not because she's terrible, because I might be. And he did what he felt he needed to do, even though it wasn't a great decision. And then he just mostly moved on. He questioned himself about it sometimes, but I think Xander, of all of them, is the most practical in a lot of ways. And maybe that comes from the fact that he doesn't have any big powers. He's just the one who sits and observes, like he tells Dawn. He sees what's going on because he's outside of it in a lot of ways. He's the outsider.
His not processing came from before the point where he left Anya at the altar, where he had feelings and
Right.
fears, but he wasn't sure what they meant, which is understandable because people, one, we all of us sometimes are in denial or don't understand our feelings or recognize them. But also, there's a lot once you say you're getting married that keeps pushing you that way. And people say, oh, everyone gets cold feet. And you
Hmm.
even think it might be that for him. So there are a lot of reasons he doesn't see it. But once he does, to your point, even when he knows the demon wasn't really showing him the future, he recognizes things about himself. And I
Hmm.
feel like he's at peace with the decision he made.
Hmm.
He's not at peace with how it affected Anya,
Right.
but he doesn't regret doing it, which is a big source of conflict for them for a while.
Hmm.
That he's not saying, oh, I want to be married. He's saying, I'm sorry I didn't see it
Hmm.
sooner.
I think that if Anya had questioned him more, I understand why she didn't. I mean, obviously she was heartbroken, but I think if Anya had questioned him more, she would have realized that he probably didn't want to be married to anybody just then because he wasn't mature enough.
Right.
But I mean, they're all so young on the show. I mean, who's getting married at 20, 21? I mean, people do, and no shade to the people who do, but for most people,
Yes.
that is not a great idea. You don't even know who you are at 21. I didn't.
That is a thing with, for me, particularly seasons, well, 5, 6, and 7, we shift to dealing with more of the adult world, and I get it because the show was not high school anymore. We had a brief focus on college, but yeah, that always hits me that these are very young people, and the whole thing of Buffy
Right.
thinking there's something wrong with her because she hasn't found the love of her life yet, or she did, but it was Angel and that didn't work. But that it's this, we're
Hmm.
just going to start treating them like they're adults. And it makes for interesting storytelling. So I'm not sorry that they did it, but there is a little bit of dissonance there with not a huge surprise that Xander at 20 or 21 might
Right.
stop and say, wait, I don't know who I am yet. I'm afraid I am not ready for this. I don't know if I can do this. And I might
Hmm.
end up just making Anya's life horrible. And he does at least recognize that. So I suppose we should talk about Anya's grief as well. I'm seeing, well, one, I'm all for sleeping with Spike to
Oh
get
yeah,
over your
yeah.
grief. Like, that seems like an excellent choice. Aside from that, there are some
Hmm.
similarities to me to Willow with the lashing out, dealing with grief by lashing out. Her initial
Hmm.
reaction of becoming a vengeance demon again, although you get the feeling she
Right.
never finds it all that satisfying when she does it for the second time.
Anya is very straightforward, which is what we love about Anya. If it comes into her head, she says it, and she doesn't mean to hurt your feelings. It's just, here's the truth as I see it. When Anya is grieving, yeah, again, she is honest about her feelings, but she's honest about her feelings in a way that kind of hurts other people. Who hasn't had a bad relationship and been like, all men are terrible and I'm going to wreak vengeance on all of you because you're all the worst.
Yes, yeah. Or if you have a joint friend group, been angry and hurt if
Right.
the
Yeah.
other people are still friends with someone who did
Yeah.
something that was pretty terrible. And I really felt for her because
Hmm.
they are her friends as well, but they're not
Right.
going to choose sides. And if they had to,
Absolutely.
Xander is their oldest friend. And that's just, oh, I feel so bad for her when she's saying that. Congratulations, Xander. They all still love you.
And as a human, they're her only friends. She only has them through Xander. And that happens to people sometimes where their friend group ends up getting mixed with a relationship. And then you're left reeling after that because you've lost all your support in one go. Because, you know, they were willing to support Anya. I mean, obviously they recognized how terrible it was. They were trying to rally around her, but their priority was Xander, which you can't really blame them for that. Like you said, he's their older friend, so she must have felt incredibly betrayed on multiple levels. So what was she going to do? She went back to what she knew, where she had friends and acceptance, but it wasn't satisfying the way she wanted it to be because she didn't want to kill Xander.
That's right. Ultimately, when finally she had a chance, she didn't want to do it.
Mm-mm. She truly loved
She's a
him.
different person, different kind of grief than
Hmm.
Willow's. But for her, we see her gradually go through that process and recognize
Hmm.
that. I mean, Anya is over 1,000 years old.
Right.
So maybe some of that was ultimately getting to where she needed to be without trying to destroy the entire world.
Right. But I mean, there are also different levels of grief. Losing a loved one to because they broke up with you is very different than losing a loved one to murder
Yes.
or
Yeah.
even natural death. I feel like Willow's extreme response is understandable. I mean, it's not great. I don't want her to destroy the world, but I can certainly understand where she was coming from. What does she want with the world? The world let her down, and the one thing she cared about the most was destroyed. So she's just going to destroy everybody else. What's the point?
Knowing that somebody chose to do that, murdered Tara,
Hmm.
and she kills Warren, and yet it doesn't fix anything.
No.
And I feel like that has to be, well, it's one of the hardest things as a victim of a crime, even if the person is put in jail or whatever it is that happens. Sometimes there's some closure with that, but it does not take away the loss. It doesn't fix it. It doesn't bring them back. And then what does Willow do? Like, where does she go from there? And because she has so much power and nowhere else to go, first it's Jonathan and Andrew, and then it's, yeah, everybody. Because you're right, the entire
Hmm.
world has let her down.
I almost feel like that's a form of bargaining, though. Like people think that bargaining is when you're like speaking to God or the universe, and you're like, if you bring my loved one back, I'll do whatever. And that's not what bargaining is. Most of us know that that's not a thing that can happen. So, what bargaining really means is that we are trying to change our grief. We're trying to change that incident into something else. So, I think that Willow was trying to basically bargain with the world so she didn't have to feel so bad. And you can't bargain with the universe like that. You have to go through it. So when killing Warren wasn't satisfying, then she wanted to go after the others, and she couldn't find them. Her friends turned against her. They were trying to help her, but in her mind, they were trying to block her from her goal of feeling better. So then she's going to destroy the world, which arguably she would feel better because everything would be gone.
That's a great point. She would get out of that feeling. And it is very similar to
Hmm.
the seed from season 4 when she's saying, My will be done. And what she wants initially is to stop feeling the pain. And then it
Hmm.
spreads out to all these other things and people and
Right.
consequences.
I think we all want to escape pain when we're grieving
Yes,
or anytime.
and rush through it if we could. Like there is always that thing if you have to go through it. Even one of my least favorite Buffy episodes, Beer Bad,
Yeah.
is Buffy wanting to find a way to not feel when she finally recognizes the truth about Parker. And then there's this beer, and she's able to drink and for a little bit feel light and fun and joke around and forget, which of course has not good consequences other than she gets to conk Parker over the head.
Worth it.
Yes, in real life, not recommended, but
No.
in this universe,
Right.
it's a much smaller grief, but there is that is part of why people drink or do other things, just to get out of those feelings. There's other things too, but I want to make sure we get to season 7, An Empty Places, the episode where Buffy's friends push her out, tell her to leave. And you had mentioned to me the role that you saw grief playing in that. So I'm really curious to hear about it. I have not yet done that episode on the podcast, and I haven't rewatched it in a while. So tell me, you said you just rewatched it.
Yeah. So it's one of my least favorite episodes because I hate the way they treat Buffy. They make me so angry. But when I rewatched it through a lens of grief, because I had this theory that it was about grief because Xander had lost his eye, a couple of the potentials died, some of the potentials were injured, and Buffy really had a hard time prevailing. She didn't prevail. She failed. I mean, she got people out, but Caleb was stronger than her in that moment. And I think that what happened was, as a whole, the group had been looking to Buffy. They had her on a pedestal, that she was going to be able to save them from anything. Xander has this beautiful speech right before they go out that Buffy has never failed. She's always come through for us, so we just need to trust her. They had all been reluctant to go. None of them thought it was a good idea, but then they followed her and these terrible things happened. I think that partially made them face their own mortality, because if Buffy can fail, then definitely any of them can die.
If you listened last week, you know I recently released the latest book in my QC Davis mystery series, The Skeptical Man, where Quill tries to solve the murder of a dear friend's husband. He is a magician with a complicated past that includes exposing psychics who run fraudulent schemes on grieving parents. You can find that at lisalilly.com/skeptical.
Xander got hurt. It was the first significant time Xander got hurt the entire series. I mean, every other time has been bumps and bruises and things that he's come back quickly from, but the eye, he's never going to come back from that. So I think that when they lashed out, I mean, that's part of grief. I think two things were happening. They were angry. When something bad happens to us, we get angry at God or the universe or whatever, because why did you let this happen? So I think in this context, they focused their anger on Buffy because she was convenient. She was a convenient scapegoat. And second, I think it was a form of bargaining. If we don't let Buffy be in charge anymore, bad things can't happen to us anymore, right? Because Buffy is the reason this happened. Not Caleb, not the first evil, not bad luck and hard circumstances. And when I looked at it from that perspective, from each and every one of them, the way Willow spoke up, even Xander, he listened to what everybody said. And then he said, I can't be with you on this one, Buffy. I can't see it your way. And Giles is probably the one that bothered me the most. But even Giles, I think, was afraid. People are afraid they don't know what to do with it. When I watched it from that perspective, it was a lot easier to swallow, because right after a grief, right after a major crisis, people don't know how to act. They don't know how to deal with that. We don't have checklists of, after bad things happen, this step 1, do this, step 2, do this, step 3, do that, and then you'll be fine. So they're all trying to cope while Buffy's saying, okay, let's go back in. We've got to do it again. And they haven't even had time to process the first time. Now, Buffy, she's always full steam ahead. I'm not going to sit and process this. I'm not going to think about my feelings. We're just going to go. Whereas the rest of them, like, slow down. We need a minute here. But of course, they didn't say that. They said, okay, we're not going to do it your way, so you need to get out. And Buffy didn't have a problem getting out, really, because that's how she handles grief and betrayal. She could have fought harder.
That's a great point. Buffy's instinct with grief or betrayal or any of those things is to go off by herself.
Hmm.
I'm intrigued by the idea that it is grief over both the losses they had and, as you said, facing their mortality, because it's true. If Buffy can't prevail, Buffy with faith, with the potentials can't prevail, then what
Right.
hope is there?
Both Buffy and Spike,
That's right, Spike as
the
well.
two strongest of them, because Faith wasn't in at the time. They both got their butts kicked.
Faith comes in after and helps. And they had, because Faith was there in the house, there is an alternative, which she was not seeking. She was not trying to push Buffy out, but just the fact that she's there opens that, well, we'll make it be Faith. And it's no surprise that she and Buffy differ on how to do things. I had some trouble with Xander and Willow because they have seen Buffy go through times when it seemed like with Glory or with Adam, powerful foes who could knock Buffy out. But you make a good point. If Xander had been beat up before, but this is a permanent injury that is not going to be fixed.
Hmm.
That is something that would take some time to deal with. And in the moment when this is happening and Buffy's saying, go back in, he's disagreeing
Hmm.
with her, which, of course, that's a lot of grief for him.
Hmm.
And then Giles, I feel like I have trouble with Giles in season 6 and 7, but you could see it also as he worries that Buffy is so wrong about Spike, and that's a
Hmm.
huge danger, and that her judgment has been clouded. So I feel like
Yes.
maybe
Same.
that probably contributes as well. And underneath it, I'm sure he still has that fear of Buffy dying and fearing that if she stays in charge, that is what's going to happen.
So the interesting thing about Willow and Xander that I noticed on this rewatch is that when Xander was in the hospital and Buffy came in briefly to visit them, Willow wanted her to sit with them and she said, "Let's play card games." And Buffy said, "No, no, no, I have to get back to work." And the expression on Willow and Xander's faces was just, it was so heartbreaking. They just wanted her to sit with them for a minute. And Buffy, that's not how she handles grief. She probably felt
Yes.
incredibly guilty about what happened to Xander, and she didn't want to deal with it. So the way she deals with things is she gets back to work, because if she solves the problem, if she defeats the first, then it's all okay, right? She did her job. So when she pushed them away in the hospital, I think that led to the way they treated her during that meeting, because she is up there going it alone again. This is the way it is. This is the way we're going to do it. I'm in charge. I am the one. And I think that Willow lashed out because she felt that Buffy was once again not sitting with her friends for a moment in their grief. And that's what Willow wants. She wants to sit and process and talk things through. We've seen that with her. And watching Xander's face during that discussion, he doesn't say anything until the end. He just listens to what everybody has to say. And then he pronounces his decision. "I just can't see it your way, Buffy." And I think that's because Buffy isn't listening. Ultimately, she's right. They do need to go back in, but she didn't let anybody take a breath. It had to be now.
That scene in the hospital was just heartbreaking because I could feel each of their feelings. I can completely see why Buffy, she just couldn't. If she'd even been able to say,
Hmm.
I want to be here with you, I want to play cards, and I feel like I can't because
Right.
this is looming and I need to fix it. Even just a
Hmm.
few moments might have made a difference, but Buffy just can't do that.
No.
It hit me personally because it when my dad was in the hospital and it was pretty clear he was dying, one of my brothers was there and he's like, okay, I'm going to come back tomorrow. And I wanted to say, they've been really clear,
Hmm.
like tomorrow, like, don't you want to be here? And also, I would like you here, but I could kind of see that he couldn't. And we talked about it years later, and he talked about why he couldn't. He
Hmm.
had lost his daughter a couple of years ago, and he couldn't. I mean, that was horrible as well for all of us, but it was his daughter, and he's like, I couldn't. And
Right.
I'm glad I could
Hmm.
recognize that because my first thing was, how could you be so disconnected or in denial or what are you doing? And then I thought, no, for
Hmm.
whatever reason, he can't hear these words. But I was in
Right.
my 40s at that point, had a lot more life experience. And even then, most of my grieving was just, I did not handle things well, but at
Yes.
least I recognized that. But if I had been 18 or 20, would I have been able to understand, why someone I cared about wasn't staying with me? I don't know.
Right.
Willow and Xander and Buffy had been together for so long. There was something I was going to say about the scene when they tell her to leave, but that Buffy, the going back. She's right that they have to go back, and yet, in a way, she would have been wrong if they went back right then because she didn't
Hmm.
have another plan. And I think
Hmm.
you hit it that she is trying to fix it so that it'll at least be worth it, I guess, if she could take everyone back and they could prevail. And
Right.
maybe she would have figured it out. She knew Caleb had something, but
Hmm.
maybe not. Like it turned out better when she goes back alone
Hmm.
and doesn't try to fight him directly. And would she have been able to take a different approach if they went right back? Like maybe not. So Buffy needed
Hmm.
maybe that time as well.
Hmm. And Faith is an interesting character. We haven't gotten into Faith much. Of all the characters, she is the one who handles that whole kicking Buffy out the best. She doesn't want it, but when she sees it's inevitable, she kind of facilitates it. But after Buffy leaves, they all want to talk. And she says, "Look, we're all tired. We just need to sleep on this, and we'll talk about it in the morning." And really, that's what Buffy should have done if she hadn't been so caught up in her guilt and her grief over what happened.
I love Faith's arc through Buffy and Angel,
Yes.
and she handled things well with Buffy when she followed her out and said,
Hmm.
I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this. And actually, Buffy, I thought, was good with Faith then, too. Like, she's not blaming Faith. She did a little
Hmm.
bit before, but she didn't out on the porch. And
Right.
I loved that Faith was like, look, we can't solve this tonight. And then later, she is very clear with the potentials who now want everything. We're going to do this democratically. Well, not all of them, but we're going to have a vote. And she's like, no, you know,
Hmm.
someone's got to make the decision. It's going to be me because this is my
Hmm.
responsibility. And in some ways, maybe because she doesn't have that guilt, I feel like it is not easier for her, but it's clearer for her what she needs to do. And she doesn't have
Hmm.
the mixed feelings Buffy did even before this happened about leading and having to lead them into battle. Because I feel like that for Buffy is a lot of the arc from when the potentials come is that weight of trying to fight in a different way, in a way that involves it's like generals sending soldiers into battle. It's very different than Buffy
Hmm.
going in and risking her own life, or Buffy and Faith
Right.
going in and jointly making that decision and risking their lives. She is sending others. She is risking other people's lives. I guess in a way, there's her friends have always been on the line, but
Hmm.
theirs was more of a choice. The potentials are stuck and they are looking to her and they
Hmm.
really can't walk away. And it's really hard for her.
Absolutely. And I think that in some ways it is easier for Faith because she's already hit rock bottom. She's already worked through her guilt and shame over the terrible things she did. So what she's going to do going forward is hard, but she's already had to do some deep introspection with her feelings. And she had that time in prison where I'm sure she thought about things. Whereas Buffy's never really had anything to be guilty or ashamed of on this level. Maybe killing Angel, but I feel like she understood why she had to do it, even when she felt terrible about it. So Buffy's never had this level
Yes.
of guilt and shame getting someone killed before, and she doesn't know how to manage it. I mean, none of us do. So she did not react the best.
I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, Faith has dealt with a lot of guilt,
Hmm.
a lot, and did terrible things and
Hmm.
had to find a way, purposely did them, and had to find a way to deal with
Hmm.
that. That serves her well in these last episodes of the show.
Yeah, I love Faith's arc. I love morally gray characters. They're kind of catnip for me. Faith, I did not like her in the early seasons. Just because a lot of times we weren't supposed to. But Faith really had a wonderful arc, and where she turned out, when I rewatch Faith episodes, I like her a lot more knowing where she's going to end up.
If you enjoy short stories and want a fun Halloween read, you may want to check out my collection, The Tower, formerly known as Sears, and 2 other tales of urban horror. The title story was made into the short film Willis Tower. In this collection of Twilight Zone-like short stories, a recruiting event at an amusement park turns deadly when the attractions develop minds and purposes of their own. A woman struggles with whether to stay in her soulless job, unaware that far more than her career is at stake, and an unpopular new law firm chairman faces not only disgruntled attorneys, but a haunted skyscraper bent on destruction. You can find The Tower, formerly known as Sears, and 2 other tales of urban horror in ebook or paperback on all your favorite retailers, or find links on my website at lisalilly.com/the-tower. What you said about grief and anger, and people get angry and get mad and blame someone, we see it again when Faith leads them and there's that explosion and potentials. Some of them get killed, they get really seriously injured. They're not mad at Faith, but they're mad at themselves, or they're angry. I think it's Amanda who says, "Oh, is this our punishment?"
Yes.
So I suppose maybe not anger, but like guilt, fear of punishment. If something bad happens, as humans, we want a reason. And even if the reason our brain gives us is a terrible one, you deserved it, our brain will try to find cause. And so then they're saying, oh, is it us? It's because we threw Buffy out. It's because we followed Faith. And Buffy's like, no, this could have happened to me too. We already saw that this happened to me, but it is so hard to accept that sometimes really bad things happen and it isn't someone's fault. Maybe it was avoidable, maybe it wasn't, and so many things aren't. And I think that's often the hardest part in grief as well, that you have to accept that, or I guess you don't have to, but part of it is this thing happened and there's no reason for it.
Right. Well, and trying to find those reasons is also a way of taking control. And having control of your life in a lot of ways is a good thing, but there is so much that's out of our control in our lives. But being able to say, is this our punishment, implies that you could have controlled the outcome. And in some ways it feels better, because they blamed Buffy and that didn't work. It wasn't Buffy's fault that this happened. So then they followed Faith, and people got killed under Faith's watch too, as they would have. So then they feel like, well, okay, blaming Buffy didn't work, so let's not blame Faith. So maybe it was what we did that caused this, even though it already happened. I do think that that's a very normal human thing to want to do. And it's also a form of bargaining. If we hadn't done this thing wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, and it makes you feel like you could potentially control things in the future by doing things right. The first therapist I ever saw said to me at one point, if things really work like that, she's like, they would have no trouble filling up the churches, because everyone would be there and they'd say the right prayers and nothing bad would happen to anybody ever. So we would all be there all the time. And I was like, okay, that's a good point. Like if it was that simple, here is the formula and nothing bad will happen. But she's like, yeah, clearly look around. That is not how the world works, which helped me.
Part of it is our society does a terrible job of dealing with grief. Back in the olden days, you wore a certain color a period of time and everybody knew that you were grieving. Or you wore an armband and then everybody knew it was an external symbol. And what happens these days is a generous company gives you 3 to 5 days off of work.
Yeah, if you're lucky.
And then you have to go back and pretend everything's normal, and you look normal on the outside, but people are treating you different because they don't know what to say to you. I mean, what do you say to somebody who's had a loss? It's very hard to manage our own pain, let alone someone else's. As a society, we don't know what to do with that. There's no prescribed plan. You go to the funeral, you send a card or flowers, and then your job is done. You don't have to do anything else for the person who's grieving. So I think that what happened in that episode was a reflection of that. Nobody knew how to handle any of it. Nobody sat them down and said, okay, look, bad things happen. Sorry, it's terrible, it's tragic, but this is life. So let's talk about what happened and then let's do what we have to do, but we can still talk. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, right. Even in our stories, because it's
Right.
reflecting that experience of life where so rarely does that happen. I wouldn't have minded seeing that instead of Anya and Andrew at the hospital. That just wasn't one of my favorite scenes. Remember, there was that extended scene with the two of them. I'm sure there'd be, I don't, you might love it. I don't know. But I'm like, I could have used some grief processing instead.
I do appreciate that they did a tiny, tiny bit of that. Like you said, when the one potential went to Buffy and said, is this our fault? And she said, no, of course not. That was a tiny, teeny little piece of it. And then the talk
Yes.
Buffy and Faith had afterwards, I thought was lovely.
Yes, that was great.
Faith admits that she was jealous of Buffy, and then she got to live her life for a minute and was like, I never felt so alone in my life. And that was such a lovely bonding moment between them because Buffy and Faith, they're never going to be best friends, but they are the only two who can really understand what the other one has been through. Even when all the potential slayers become slayers, I mean, that's then you're in a group. You have all these other
It's
ladies.
a different
Yes.
experience.
Whereas Faith thought she was alone as the Slayer, and then, she found Buffy and Giles, and Buffy was alone as the Slayer.
And in fiction, when it comes down to it, scenes where people just sit down and process their feelings in a healthy way don't,
Yes.
don't make for good
Yes.
fiction. And it would be weird if they did that out of the blue when no one had been doing it to that point. Also realistic for they are in a war, and
Hmm.
I have never been in that situation. I can only imagine that soldiers likewise don't, in the middle of battles or after battles or going to the next one, don't have the opportunity to process their feelings, and it does terrible things to people. So there's no room for that for Buffy or for the
Absolutely
potentials.
not. And, when I worked Mobile Crisis, we were out in some pretty difficult situations, some pretty frightening situations, or just emotionally heart-wrenching situations. You don't have time when you're dealing with a crisis to think about your feelings in the moment if you're trying to be the one to facilitate a solution to the crisis. You simply don't have time, you don't have the energy, you don't have the bandwidth. Plus, you're no good to other people as a therapist, as a crisis worker, if you're breaking down with them, even if you feel like, oh my God, I
Yeah.
can't believe that you're going through this right now. It's awful. So you have to kind of separate your emotions a little bit in the moment. That's not to say you won't process them later, but in the moment, Buffy didn't have time to feel her feelings. She's responsible for the world. She's the one girl in all the world. And yes, her and Faith, but she is responsible for it all. So if she sits there and breaks down and has her moment and processes her feelings, what happens to the rest? What happens if someone gets hurt while she's processing her feelings? How guilty would she feel then?
Oh, and just think about season 6 when she becomes catatonic. There's no room for her to process her feelings, and then it all hits her and she shuts down. But I feel like that's her fear all along. If I let
Hmm.
myself feel these things, it will be
Hmm.
too much. And to your point, I won't be able to save the world. And yeah, I've been talking about the potentials and I almost forgot. It's not just the
Right.
potentials, it's the entire world. And this is this battle at an epic scale, which she's dealt with
Hmm.
before in a way with this apocalypse and that one, but this one is everything, the first evil, the big evil, like
Hmm.
it's the final battle type of thing. And so even more so, how does
Hmm.
she give herself time? There is no time, there's no space.
Definitely.
We could probably talk for hours on this. Is there anything else, because we'll have to wind up soon, that you wanted to cover?
Hmm.
There's a lot out there already on Joyce's death and Buffy's grief there, so we haven't gone to that. But is there anything else you wanted to say?
Well, I know that Spike is a controversial character. but I would argue that
Ah, yes.
of all of them, he is probably the one who manages grief in the healthiest way.
Interesting. So tell me what you mean by that or why you think so.
So Spike is the guy who gets things done. Spike without a soul and Spike with a soul, he gets things done. When he has a problem, he finds a way around it. Now, when I say he's the healthiest one dealing with his grief, I don't mean that he always does good things. I just mean that for
Right.
him and processing his feelings, he actually does things. So like when Drusilla leaves him and he goes to kidnap Willow in Lover's Walk, he's trying to get a love potion to get Drusilla back because he is grieving that relationship and he's going to do something about it. When Buffy rejects him in Fool for Love and insults him, he goes after her to kill her because he's not going to tolerate that. He's going to figure out a way to deal with it. When he doesn't save Dawn and therefore doesn't save Buffy, he works with the Scoobies, even though he doesn't like them or want to work with them. He doesn't want to be there, it's clear. But he does it because that's his way of making amends to Buffy, even though she's not around. So he is what eventually, when he is, after he's got his soul back and he is struggling with that, what gets him out of the basement ultimately is the fact that he needs to go help Buffy. And that's what gives him the strength to go forward. So Spike is an interesting character in that perspective because he does process his feelings and he does try to do things to work through them. Now, no therapist is going to recommend Spike's methods.
Let's hope not. I agree that I think he is the most aware of his feelings
Yes,
and the least afraid of feeling.
that's probably a better way of putting it. Yeah.
He is very aware of other people's feelings as well, which I've
Hmm.
always found interesting about Spike. Even when he can't stand any of them,
Hmm.
he is the one who sees. He sees how much Willow, of course, he does by that point like Willow, but he sees how much Willow is grieving in something blue. And
Hmm.
he's like, somebody says she's handling it pretty well. He's like, are you, what? No, she's not. He is very, I don't know if the word emotionally intelligent is right given, his choices,
No.
but he
Yeah.
is aware and he's empathetic even when he has no soul. He understands
Hmm.
people's feelings. He understands Anya's feelings. It's part of why they connect.
Hmm.
And yes, his ways of addressing it, because he has no soul and he's evil, are
Right.
not good ways to do it. Once he has a soul, when he's not being controlled by the first, he says what he feels, he says what he thinks. You wouldn't say he always makes great choices even then, but he
Mhm.
really tries. He doesn't avoid. When he thinks that there's no way to stop him from killing again when the first is controlling
No.
him, he's saying to Buffy, you have to kill me. Could do terrible things. She doesn't do it. He talks about how he feels about her and how
Hmm.
he thinks she feels about him. Like, he might be wrong, but he's going to talk about it. He's not going to avoid
Hmm.
it, and he doesn't isolate. To your point, he's like, okay, what am I going to do about this?
Yeah.
I want to change this. I want to address this. So it is weird that, or maybe just interesting that one of our more difficult characters morally, to your point, the gray areas, is probably the most emotionally healthy
Yes.
in the sense of given the parameters of the character.
Like you said, just the way the choices he makes are not fantastic, but he does try. And I think that's one of the things that's so endearing about him because he is evil, but the choices he makes, most of us could be like, yeah, a love potion might fix this. I could see that. Or,
Yeah, yeah, like we won't do it, but you could see that you're like, yeah, wouldn't that be great if you could? If you could do that and it would be okay. If you just set aside consequences and morals and all those things. And if I was thinking of that moment when he does go to kill Buffy, he takes that, I
hmm.
think it's a rifle, and then he
Hmm.
sees her on the porch and he sees that she's crying.
Hmm.
He is aware of how she feels, how he feels, and he asks if he can help. It's this, he shifts, and it's not like the other feelings go away, the anger and the hurt at being rejected, but he is able to reassess based on a different situation than what he thought he was walking into. And that is something too. To be able to be that aware of what's going on with someone else and what's in your own heart, and not just go ahead with the course that you set out, and let that anger go and feel that compassion, is also something that you generally need to be pretty emotionally healthy to do. Again, setting aside his actual choice of getting a rifle and going to kill Buffy. And I love that moment for him because that tells us so much about Spike.
That is one of my favorite moments in the entire series, when he just sits with her. I feel like that's part of the reason she can talk to him sometimes, because sometimes he just sits there and he gets it. And you can tell he gets it by the way he acts and reacts. Because he asks her the question, is there anything I can do? And when she doesn't answer, he doesn't say another word. He's just there.
He does what is so hard to do.
Yes.
He sits with her in her grief and her pain, and he can do that and doesn't need to push her to feel better or even to let him do something. He can just be there. And that is a really difficult thing to do for somebody. Some of it, sure, is she doesn't care so much what Spike thinks of her, but I think a lot of it also is that there isn't anyone else who really does that for her. Giles probably would, but he is not her peer.
No.
And then so much in season 6, he's not there. There's a little too much of the parent-child almost relationship there that, he can let Buffy feel bad, but she's going to be concerned about how he sees her. Is she living up to what he expects of her? Is she making him be worried? And that's not there with Spike.
It's harder to be honest with a parent figure, especially when you want them to love and respect you. It's hard. We have this idea that we're supposed to be perfect, even though people really love vulnerability. And I think that it's harder with a mentor who you want to impress to say, hey, I don't know if I can handle this. What should I do?
And there's the dual issue of she also protects Giles at times. So it's another reason to want to be strong and not have him concerned, where she doesn't need to protect Spike. Most of the series she doesn't want to.
No.
He can protect himself, at least from demons, and he doesn't need her. Well, this has been so great talking with you about grief and the Buffyverse. Where can people find your novel, Not Dead Enough, if they want to read your fiction, which I highly recommend?
Well, thank you. You can find it anywhere online where books are sold. It's on Amazon, Books A Million, Barnes & Noble, Walmart, Target. So find it through my website, TyffanyDNeiheiser.com, which is probably impossible to spell for anybody. I'm on Instagram.
I will put a link in the show notes.
Okay, that's good. I'm on Instagram, so you can find links there, but it's not hard to find. You can find me through Goodreads.
And you can find it at the library, which I did. Thanks again, and I am just so glad we had a chance to have this talk.
Same. It's been great. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thank you so much for listening. Come back in 2 weeks for First Date, where Xander and Buffy both have evening plans that might be dates or encounters with demons, and the first returns to torment Andrew. You can find back episodes of Buffy and the Art of Story, as well as the Buffy and the Art of Story books and all my fiction at lisalilly.com. To support the podcast, hear extra bonus content, and get each regular episode a few days early, join the Patreon community at patreon.com/LisaMLilly. That's Lisa, M as in Marie, Lilly. Music for this episode was written and performed by Robert Newcastle. Buffy and the Art of Story is a production of Spiny Woman, LLC. Copyright 2024. All rights reserved.